Gardens are one of the world's great wonders. Going back to Babylon, the aesthetic, the re-aestheticization of nature has always fascinated us. Nearly every major city has a botanical garden, a space for learning about the plants of the world and fostering young gardeners around the globe. And Houston is no exception. The Houston Botanic Garden carries this mission on here in town, and today we're sitting down with some of the members of their team to talk all about their work. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Associate Director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Before we jump into our conversation, I also want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in our spring fund drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes directly from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and you want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. And in the weeks coming up, Gulf Streams will feature conversations with experts on things like nature-based solutions, the Texas climate, and the impacts of the BP oil spill. If you want to become a station sustainer, ask about our memory bricks, permanent inscribed tributes to your generosity here at the studio. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn all about the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month. We are delighted to bring you important conversations on environmental and climate topics here in Houston and beyond, all through Gulf Streams, and can only do so with your support. So please call 713-526-KPFT, make a one-time or sustainer donation, mention Gulf Streams, and help keep ad-free public radio here on the air in Houston. All right, so into our actual conversation for today. I am delighted to welcome three folks from the Houston Botanic Garden to talk all about the work that the Botanic Garden has been up to. Justin Lacey is Director of Communications and Community Engagement. Aaron Mills is the Associate Director of Family Programs. And Lindsay Ware is a horticulturalist with the Botanic Garden. So thank you so much for taking time out of your Monday morning to come join us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, good morning.
Thanks for having us.
So just to start off, I'm going to ask a slightly overly broad question, because I actually do think it's really worth kind of parsing into, but what is a botanical garden? I think we have like a rough idea of like, oh, that's a place I go to look at plants and maybe take a class, but there's actually a very fascinating history to these institutions. So Justin, could you tell us just a little about the function of a botanic garden and why these institutions matter?
Absolutely. What we tell people to kind of help them visualize it is we refer to ourselves as a living museum, or sometimes it's even easier for them to think of us as a zoo for plants. And so much like you go to the zoo to see, animals that you're not going to necessarily see, in your backyard, but you're not just seeing that, right? Like the zoo is doing things, our zoo, of course, here in Houston is doing things around the world to help make sure that outside of captivity, those animals are being conserved, and we're doing similar things with plants. And so we have living collections. We always tell people we're more than a park. We're more than just landscaping, right? Like we are growing an extremely diverse collection here in Houston of plants, tropical, subtropical, arid plants all around the world. Yes, they're beautiful in the right time of year, and we want you to come and see them and enjoy them that way. But, we're doing conservation work with oaks and magnolias and Louisiana iris. And so the things that we're doing and learning in growing those plants in our environment are things that we can share, both with the home gardener, but then also with other professionals. And so yes, it's display, it's science, education, conservation. It's one of the things we deal with too, obviously, is not being just a display garden. The garden looks different in every season. We're not just about the blooms. The blooms are great. We encourage you. We do a lot on our social media to let you know when certain things are in bloom. But, people can come and learn, about winter dormancy of plants, and see, we talk about seeing the bones of the garden in the winter. And so I think it's really important for people to understand a botanic garden is really a year-round learning experience, and not just a pretty place all the time.
So, okay, you've thoroughly derailed me because I was going to follow up with a nice place that you totally segued into about the importance of seeing things throughout seasons. And instead, I'm completely distracted by the fact that in conservation work, you're talking about oaks and Louisiana iris, which longtime listeners will have heard me say 1,000 times. I'm from Louisiana, and my parents have Louisiana iris in their backyard. And so I'm kind of fascinated by the idea of conservation of things that I think, oak trees in Houston, we aren't probably thinking in terms of, they're certainly the most visible tree in town. It's certainly something we're very familiar with. So can you tell us a little bit about the conservation work, especially about some of these things you just named that are so, I think we think of as fundamental to the places we live? Because I don't think a lot of folks are jumping to conservation and the first thing on their mind would be an oak tree.
Well, and of course, we think oak, and obviously something visually is going to come to mind. And here in Houston, it's probably a live oak,
Yep.
maybe a post oak, something like that. Those are just two species out of so many. And so we are working, we've already had our associate director of natural areas has gone out on, collection trips, collecting acorns and things, a lot of it out to the west of here. And so, the thing to remember, and we're seeing it with the post oaks even here locally, is as climate is changing and conditions are changing, we have a lot of post oaks on our site that unfortunately are struggling. And so, that's the same, that may be the same thing in another region. The oaks that they have that are more common there are struggling. And so we are growing those things. I mean, the other thing about the garden and our conservation efforts is a lot of it, especially right now, we're just being it's happening behind the scenes. And that's the thing people have to remember as well. When you come to visit the garden, you see what's out in the living collections now, but your ticket, your membership, you're also supporting work that's going on behind the scenes that, years from now may be out for display as well. But we have all of these oaks that have been collected, acorns and things that are growing, they may be just an inch tall right now. But we've collected those from places so that we can grow that. With Botanic Gardens, it's a really collegial network. And so if we are growing something that, Louisiana iris is a great example, there are conditions in Louisiana that are not as favorable as they used to be. And so by us growing those things here, we kind of have this repository going where it's a very collective experience. And if something does well here and it's not doing well back home, either we share that back or we keep that lineage going. Things have to kind of move around. Gardening zones are changing north to south with the climate. And so that's why, having this great collective group of gardens that are working on these things together is so important.
That's interesting. It's something that it reminds me of something that I've heard Jaime Gonzalez, very prominent local conservationist, who I'm seeing all of you nod, which is not at all surprising. But Jaime's been on the show many times and is a friend. And I will say Jaime, talks a lot about the fact that we were, a moniker of the city was Magnolia City. And the reality is magnolias are finding it harder and harder to thrive in Houston. And, we're looking at 20 to 30 years down the road of how the climate around us is naturally changing. We're seeing that really be a question of how well this plant that have been emblematic of the city might actually do. And so I find that fascinating to think both about what you're saying just around the conservation aspect of this, but also kind of that exchange that you mentioned around Botanic Gardens and that kind of network of imagining how we both show different places, localized flora from different places, but also thinking about that support network across regionality and even internationally. At one point, I saw Justin glance over at you, Lindsay. Was there something you wanted to jump in on the conservation side, or?
Oh, well, I can wax poetic about Louisiana irises with you all day.
Please do.
So Louisiana irises is one of our collections that we have started, and we're kind of in the first chapter of beefing up, if you will. And they're really interesting, and as you brought up, they're kind of symbolic of the area that we live in, the Gulf Coast region area. We're sitting in what used to be a wetland or a coastal prairie of some sort, and I think a lot of people forget about that as they're caught up in the hustle and bustle of Houston and H-Town, and so that's something that's beautiful about the garden as well. And I get to work with the Louisiana Iris collection, and like you, my mama's people are from Louisiana, from Calcasieu Parish, and Louisiana irises were basically the beginning of me fallen in love with plants in general and the wild world. And there's about five. Well, there's five OGs, I call them. There's five original Louisiana irises, and as everyone knows, there's thousands and thousands of cultivars that have been derived from those Louisiana irises. Of the five original ones, four of them are native from here all the way into South Louisiana. But one of them, the Iris nelsoni, is only native to a certain little part of southern Louisiana, and it's a red iris. And so, like Justin was saying earlier, that's part of starting a conservation collection, is getting those things back into the rotation, back into our ecology, so that, you know, checks and balances can start happening, and also they're beautiful.
To follow up on that comment about the beauty of it, I want to go back a little bit to what Justin was saying around the Botanic Garden is not just for the spring blooms, right? Or for fall foliage, or, you know, any of these kind of high point watershed moments you might think of in kind of plant life cycles, but is meant to be a space to learn throughout the year. And as you had mentioned, kind of the bones of the plants, which I would love to hear some about the importance ecologically of the bones of those plants at some point, if we want to get into that a little bit. But it's something that I've heard other folks talk about as well, is that importance of actually, with our kind of manicured landscapes, we often get really uncomfortable with the dead periods in plant life. And I've heard landscape architects in particular talk about the importance of reminding people these things are secular. Life and death go together. Plants, you know, they go away in the winter and they come back, and like that's part of the excitement. Also, some of that foliage can be beautiful in the winter as we take in what's changed. But in thinking of that, you know, it's one of these things where we like the evergreens. We like, you know, especially in our home landscapes, try to keep things where it's really focused. And, you know, knowing from my own lawn and, you know, how I'm sitting around going, is it deciduous? Okay, all right. How many of these can I have, and what do I have to cover it with? And so, I mean, there's a lot of kind of attention to a particular aesthetic that neglects certain periods. And I think it's really fascinating that you bring up, and so I'd love to hear some about the important work of like winter foliage, actually, and some of that dead period you're talking about, but also that broader mission of really getting us to reconnect to, wait, these things they're more than just, you know, when things are blooming and beautiful, and actually there's important work happening at all times in our ecosystem, and trying to learn about and be comfortable actually with what things look like at different periods.
I will say I am not a plant person.
Yet you work at a botanical garden.
I did not come to this job as a plant person, but I have learned a lot. And I think for me, and so I say this coming from more of that mindset where I was the type that looked at things and I was like, oh, that's dead, that's whatever. You know, the key first thing that I have learned is get rid of that word dead, right? Mm. Like in the winter, plants are like us, they get tired. And winter is a time of rest. And so you talk about what's going on. You know, I'm learning more and more, like those plants are conserving energy because, you know, those spring blooms that we love and that leafing out period, that's tiring, right? And so, you know, thinking about winter as a time of rest, a time for the plant to regroup. I will say I've been with the garden now more than 5 years. So we opened in September of 2020, and one of the first things we experienced was Winter Storm Uri in February of 21. And again, I was not a plant person. And so when we came, you know, we tried. We have 132 acres, 20 plus already developed. You can't cover all of it, right? And so when we went back about 5 days after the worst of it as a team to help uncover and start cleaning up, I was devastated. Yeah. And that was a really hard loss. But I have come to experience and appreciate the resiliency of nature so much after that. Because we did have to replace a lot, but there were things that came back, and I mean, they came back in full force. You know, our season right after that, once time had passed and things had time to come back, I mean, our banana plants were back up towering above our heads. And again, for me, coming from where I was, that was incredible to have gone from just this complete devastation, like you've lost a friend, you've lost a pet or something like that, and then to see, no, you know, some things didn't, but so many things will come back. And so unfortunately, we've had a freeze basically every year since we opened. And it is getting to where each one, it's a little bit easier going in, knowing we're going to cover what we can cover. We know what'll come back. That's been really important as well, I think. But yeah, I mean, we want people to come. You know, what we really encourage with the garden is we sell memberships, right? And so that's easy, no extra charge admission. And we tell members, like, you're the luckiest ones, right? You have that opportunity to come and see it in each phase. You can come as often as you want. We had people actually that came, going back to Yuri, we had members that came, that were the first people back. And they told us, they said, we were here 2 weeks before. We brought our kids back now. We're going to keep bringing them back. We want them to see that cycle.
Wow. I mean, that's really encouraging. I will say I completely feel you on not identifying as a plant person. I am also relatively young in especially kind of conservation topics, shall we say, and a novice at best gardener. And yet it's so exciting. It's so delightful. Maybe I should say burgeoning gardener rather than just pure novice. But, I think there's excitement in learning about these things. And the more that you start to do so, it also gives you some defense around, like, when the snow came through, a lot of people were like, oh, are you covering your plants? Are you protecting? Or, everything's going to die? And I'm like, I planted stuff that's cold hardy. Like, it's going to look dead for a few weeks and then it's going to come back. That's what these things do. Like, it's fine. Freeze is a part of life, We don't like it when it freezes and suddenly we're in Uri and everything gets shut down on the power side. Humans are not good with freeze, but plants are remarkably okay with it quite a lot of the time. Erin, I see you jumping in.
I have so much to add. I mean, a lot of people don't realize, because we're always in such a hurry to tidy things up and make things, chop that off. But it's like they're covers. Those plants need that. It's insulation, and it's not just for the plants, but all of the creatures, right? So we're a really mild climate, so we have a lot of creatures that are here during the winter, and they're looking for cover, and that's what that is for, is absolutely for them to shelter in or to overwinter in. And if you just chop all that stuff down and throw it in a sack and put it on the curb, then all that biodiversity is going to the landfill. So kind of a big part of our habitat exhibit, which is, something we can definitely talk about more, but kind of calls out a lot of those things, like, that people are starting to hear a lot more of, like leave the leaves and leave those seed heads up, because that's their seeds for birds. All of that, dead or sleeping or whatever, that foliage is cover for overwintering, bumblebee queens, and there's just so much going on with that people don't realize. So we really encourage you to put your garden to bed and just let it sleep, and don't take its covers away until the springtime comes and it's nice and warm, and then everything can start coming out. So.
No, that's exactly where I was hoping to hear some about. Yeah, just those important insect functions actually are something I've been thinking a lot about, because as someone who just went out yesterday actually and bought a couple of seed packets around butterfly plants and various wildflowers. I mean, these are kind of crucial elements of that whole process. And so I love that we've actually started, not maybe where I was expecting to, but with a really great conversation just around that importance of the different life cycles. I want to go exactly to what you were just talking about around some of the different offerings the garden holds. And so, Lindsay, you had already mentioned coastal prairies and wetlands, and one of the things I really admire about the garden is there's a number of different places you can see things. I've just got the website pulled up, and I mean, you have model community gardens, a culinary garden, the global collection, where of course I think folks are probably most familiar with that kind of function of botanical gardens showing off plants from around the world, but also a lot of dedication to thinking really about where we live. A lot of the garden has really fascinating spaces like the Pine Grove, and there's a woodland section, stormwater wetlands, the coastal prairie. I mean, these are familiar ecotypes for folks who have been listening to the show for a while, thinking about, the Harris County region, the kind of southeast Texas region. And so getting to showcase some of our native fauna, and especially or flora rather, some of the importance of, or both, yeah, exactly, you can come and see the butterflies,
hand, yeah.
Getting to showcase that and really experience what can these spaces look like, I think is really, really important work. So I'd love to hear about, maybe we'll just start with some of your favorite parts of the garden itself, and then get into some of that work that these different sections allow you to do.
I guess
go for it.
Sure, yeah, jump in.
So my favorite spots of the garden are going to be the ones that are on the fringes, including the stormwater wetlands, the coastal prairie, which is basically a slice, about a 4 and some change acre slice of land that is being restored to what it might have looked like, a couple hundred years ago, before it was a cattle ranch, before it was a golf course. And my current obsession is the meandering Sims Bayou that wraps around most of our garden, actually. And I think, sorry, I've given this a lot of thought every day, but I think the benefit of having those types of spaces in a botanic garden like Houston Botanic Garden is you reach an audience that you wouldn't normally reach, people that, I went out into marshes and stuff duck hunting with my dad, and I hated him for it when I was a kid, but I love him for it now. And I was exposed to all of these natural ecoregions that are very unique. And, around the globe, there's no other place like the Gulf Coast on the planet. But maybe some people aren't exposed to that so much, especially since less than 1% of those areas exist in today's time. So by coming to the Botanic Garden, maybe you're introducing them to the beauty of being a little bit more wild and a little bit more feral. And so I'm a team of one, basically, just because I'm technically a conservation horticulturist, and there's 5 of us. So I cover those wild spaces. So I am trying to get those areas where they highlight the beauty, the blooms and the relationships that they have with insects, and also the bones, like he was talking about. I mean, a good example of bones is our bald cypresses that are native to our region.
My favorite tree.
They're right up there. I would say it's my favorite, but they're all my favorite. But it looks like a skeleton. For a good part of the year because it loses its needles. Thus the name bald cypress. And a lot of people go, oh, well, those cypresses are dying. And it's like, no, they don't die every year. They just lose their needles. That's the process that they do. That's the adaptation that they have made to survive the climate that they live in. And anyway, to circle back around, those places at the garden are places where you can come and see those things. And then from there, if you're really interested in our prairies and our wetlands and our bayous, which I think are just so beautiful, I don't know why you wouldn't be interested, but if it strikes a match and makes you more interested in those areas, then you can venture out. But it's a really cool way to showcase that. So.
No, I love that, and I love you mentioning that. That is part of what really inspires me in the work that the Botanic Garden is up to, partially just because I will flatly say, personal bias of being a little boy who was growing up and my parents loved to, go to a rose garden or something. And it just really wasn't my vibe. It really wasn't my thing. And so for a long time, I was very like, oh, right, gardens, okay. And then finding spaces that let me feel like, oh no, this lets me learn about the trees that I care about and feel like I'm in a woodland. This lets me experience some different spaces, even spaces that really focus on, the really important educational work around like, hey, here is nature working to keep us safe and help mitigate flooding. Like I started finding many years ago at this point, that kind of really mission-driven work really inspiring at some different places and also brought me to like, right, not everything is a rose garden. Awesome. I can enjoy this. Okay. And rose gardens are great. And if you love them, more power to you. It's just not my thing. But lots of people do. Okay. So other favorite spots in the garden.
So we've already established I don't come from a plant background, and I am a city boy through and through, born and raised in Houston. And so I think for me, probably the culinary garden has been one of the more eye-opening things. I did have my paternal grandfather was a gardener. We grew up with homemade strawberry preserves in the freezer. But when I was a kid, again, I didn't appreciate that. I didn't take time to go out there and actually see what that means. And
it's hard to fully appreciate the world as a child. It's always
it is. No,
we change. We get better. We hope.
I hope so. I think I'm getting better. But I've learned so much in the culinary garden. My key story that I like to tell on myself is. loofah. And so, my maternal grandmother we used to have sponges and, in the bath. And I always thought, and maybe the ones we had, were sea sponges, but like I thought all sponges were sea sponges. And so we're growing loofah at the garden and, seeing it grow and getting gigantic and, starting to dry out and the skin's peeling off. And it's like, yeah, that's a loofah sponge. I was like, no, that's a squash. Yeah, that's a loofah sponge. Like you purposely let it dry out, peel the skin off, and you've got a sponge. And I mean, I talk about blow my mind, but now it's my favorite thing. Every year I wait for us to do that and to see that, and I love to share that with people because there's so many other people that are learning at the same time. We're growing apples at the garden. I think of apples, I think of Washington State.
You got to sell me on this because I keep, looking at the apple trees in Houston, and I hear from some folks they really do amazing. And how are they?
Well, so I've not actually eaten one of our apples. I will admit that, but the fact that we can, right? Like again, like a learning experience. So the variety of apple that we have in our culinary garden actually comes from the Dominican Republic, and it doesn't require as many chill hours as most of the ones that we think of. Wow. And in fact, the flowers are already popping out on it too. It's one of those like harbingers of spring, which is great. But yeah, I mean, just to come into the garden and be able to see apples is maybe not something people are going to expect. So I love that there's that seasonality. I mean, we have seasonality throughout, but the culinary garden is going to be incredibly seasonal. We do have fruit trees and things that are there all the time, but things that we're growing, artichokes. I mean, things that maybe people haven't really, like the artichoke flower, like, and actually seeing that. Yeah. It just takes that to another level. And for all the other city boys and girls out there, no shame in that, to come and learn a little bit more about what you see before it makes it to the grocery store shelf.
Okay, I'm going to resist the urge to just run over to the gift shop right now and try to find a Dominican Republic apple tree. But
Dorset Golden is what it's called.
Oh, good
okay. All right. You're impressing your colleagues.
I could not think of that.
Well, it has parents that require less chill hours, and so, it's a good mashup to try and grow down here in Texas.
Good to know. All right. We're always here for a plant rec on the show. Erin, do you want to?
My heart belongs to the Global Garden just because it's just such a teaching, garden. There's so many, all of the different like bioregions that are represented, and it's in bite-sized pieces, and it's just really easy to explore. But the most of all, there's one section called the Upland Forest that I could just spend the entire day in. I spent 15 years at the Cockrell Butterfly Center, and it was all about butterfly gardening and pollinators, and so that's where my head usually is. In my entire time as a gardener has been mostly focused on plants that bugs can eat. So I've been like, it's not for me, it's for them. And all of my joy in gardening, not all of it, I'm expanding a little bit more. I grow, veggies and herbs and things like that. But when I can go out into the garden and, take my camera and just observe what is going and all the little dramas that are playing out and all of the spiders and the insects and the dragonflies and, all of the things that are just there and able to have a home. So the upland forest has got a lot of native plants, and it's just like, the perfect little size for a nice little stroll, and you could just spend so much time in there. That's where the pollinator garden is. And all the butterflies really flock to there, and there's, plants that are really important for birds. It's like a magnet for all sorts of wildlife, and it's just got some really great plants in there that I could just, take a group through, and, like, we're just going to focus on this one garden. But that's, I could spend all day out there.
No, I totally get that. I mean, that is so much of the joy of spending time in my backyard is when I see butterflies just fly through, and I feel like, okay, I did something productive. I helped something beyond myself. All right, thank you for visiting. Lindsay, something you were getting at that I'd love to open up as well is, and I really should have started here, but I got so distracted by Justin's great intro. But Botanic Garden is fairly new, and so I'd love to hear a little bit both about how it came to be, and also you were mentioning and where this came from is directly out of that. It was a cattle ranch, and then it was a golf course, and hearing a little bit just about where is the Botanic Garden, what was there before, how did it come to be, and tell us a little of that story.
Absolutely. So First things first, we're down by Hobby Airport.
Excellent.
Really key messaging, because it is hard. Houston has a lot of great green spaces, and we know that people think they know where we are. We are 45 South and Park Place,
Okay.
opposite side of the freeway from Hobby Airport. So there's the key.
Excellent.
There. But yes, so the story of the Botanic Garden actually goes back decades. And you were talking early on, obviously, about the importance of botanic gardens to major cities around the world. And so there were a number of civic-minded Houstonians who were gardeners, garden lovers, travelers, and they recognized this need for our city, right? I mean, we are an incredibly metropolitan place. We've got incredible performing arts, wonderful museum district, but we didn't really have a botanic garden in the city. And so it was really important to them that Houston have that. And so they worked tirelessly, literally for decades. As you might imagine, again, they wanted this to be in the city. And so we're talking, late 70s, early 80s, and it's getting to the point where finding land inside the city is difficult. And so a big part of that process was finding the right piece of land. And so they started down the road on a couple of different parts of town, one of which they had to bypass because a freeway was going to go through it. Imagine that. And so in 2015, during the mayorship of Anise Parker, is when things really started moving. So there were a couple of municipal golf courses. The city was not interested in maintaining those any longer, and was looking to do something else with them. And so it kind of came down to those two pieces of land. And so the Glenbrook Golf Course wound up being the piece of land that was selected. And so at that point, it was up to the nonprofit, which had been formed in 2002. We are completely a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and it was up to the nonprofit to raise $20 million to show that there was actually interest. And they were able to do that by the deadline, which then unlocked the lease on the property with the city, so the city still owns the land and the garden leases it. And from that point on, it became all about the capital campaign, which was first set at $35 million for phase one. Again, incredible support and interest. We raised $38.5 million. We're actually able to add back in a couple of things for phase one that had been cut out for value engineering purposes. And then from there, it was full speed ahead until COVID. And so, but we stuck with it. I mean, people had dreamed about this and planned for this and raised money for this for years. So we opened pretty much on schedule in September of 2020, and it was a very unusual time to have a ribbon cutting and make everybody kind of stay away from each other. But
the garden is a pretty COVID-safe activity, though, so I imagine that was actually not the worst of times in some ways for you to open.
I think we probably had a really strong what we called opening season because of that. I think, interestingly, people that maybe wouldn't have been as interested were interested and came out. Flip side, I think there were some people maybe that you think of as a little bit more traditional garden visitors that it took us a little bit longer perhaps to attract because they were older, more cautious. But no, I mean, that's really the story of it. The golf course presented an very interesting canvas with which to work. As Lindsay's already, it was a green space, not in the way that this table wants green spaces to be maintained, but that's, one of the first things they did. They actually let the site just go for a year.
Yeah.
And then there was, when I first started in August of 2019, there was a couple of women, one was on staff and one was a volunteer, and they just did a floristic study. I mean, they just went out and looked and documented everything that had come back in naturally. And that was both flora and fauna, actually. They were looking at some of the bugs and things that were being attracted to the space. And so what an interesting, thing to be able to do. And then again, I think what I love so much is we are still like right there on the bayou. I mean, Houston's Botanic Garden in the Bayou City. I mean, the site would not be what it is without the influence of Sims Bayou. It actually creates an urban island as part of our site. But like you can get out on our site and look in pretty much every direction, and aside from possibly a plane taking off from Hobby or the sound of the freeway, you don't see the city. And so we really appreciate that like urban oasis feel to it, where I think, other possible places they could have built or found land or whatever may not have had that exact same experience.
No, I really appreciate that. And yeah, the times I've been out at the garden, it is something that really stands out is just that feeling of both being by the water, which is really lovely, but also especially the way that it is designed with, as you were mentioning, some of those fringe spaces, right? You have these different, this real feeling of places that feel very much like Houston and then places that feel very unlike Houston. And sometimes that's just because of what we're familiar with, but also very much because of some of the spaces that are doing different kinds of work. Something that I would love to hear a little bit about is, I had briefly mentioned it in the list of different spaces around the garden, but there is a community garden area, and I want to use that slightly to pivot just to talk about some of the educational and outreach work that's going on. So would you, probably an Aaron question, but would you tell us a little bit just about that community garden and then some of the broader educational functions that the garden is performing?
Yeah, so, well, our community garden is, and Justin might remind me how many beds they have there. I can't remember.
There are 24.
24 beds. So
Wow, okay.
we have, it's a large space dedicated to people in the community that are looking for a space to come and grow, well, whatever they really want to grow. And so they pay a fee to sort of rent the space for the year, and to be a part of the community garden. It's definitely a community. It's a group. They kind of, are run themselves. So they've got sort of like a head gardener. And so there's a lot of sort of, coordination and people helping each other out. So, hey, I'm going to be out of town. Can you water my bed? So it definitely is a community out there. And it's really interesting to see what all people are growing. Right now they have just some kind of small, wooden beds, but we're actually involved in sort of like a partnership with Urban Harvest, where there are some grant funds that have allowed us to upgrade some of those beds. So that's really going to be exciting. Those are going to be very nice. And as a part of their, their lease agreement, they get a membership to the garden, so they can visit the rest of the garden as well. So it's a really, really neat thing.
I highlight it purely, sorry, I'm just jumping a little bit. I highlight it particularly because I think there certainly are other botanical gardens that feature community gardens, but it's not an established feature like every botanical garden has this. And I think it's really admirable because we do tend to look to botanical gardens as kind of leading cardinal, that's not a word, but you're getting what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Institutions, and I mean these kind of functions that a botanic garden provides around education, to explicitly make that one of those goals being, showcasing those local community gardens, that I think we have that idea in our head of like, these are cool spaces, people get together, but actually staking out some land and saying, no, demonstrating that like, this is something you can do in your area, showing you what a healthy one looks like, really allowing people to recognize like, you can do a lot with a small amount of square footage.
Oh, definitely.
I think that's really, really valuable for people, especially those who are coming just because maybe it's a school trip, right? And they're, just going along to see the garden, and then suddenly have this opportunity to go, oh, this is something I could actually participate in as well. This is something that I could bring back to my neighborhood or get involved with if there already is one going on in my area. I think that's really valuable work.
Oh yeah, for sure. So yeah, we are in a neighborhood. So, it's really important for us to, come across as not like kind of like a stuffy, purely aesthetic, as we've kind of discussed, we've got a lot going on, more than just you would think of a traditional, botanical garden. So, but our education, and we target everybody. From adults and kids and families, and we have a little bit of something for everyone. We're just trying to let people have fun and break through that plant blindness. And so we throw that term around a lot, and a lot of people aren't even familiar with it.
I was going to say, do you want to define plant blindness for us?
So plant blindness is just basically, and I used to have it as well, is that you just go through life with plants in the background. It's just like a green curtain that's all around us, and you really don't see the plants for what they are. They're just there, and it's taken for granted. And we might think like, oh, sure, it provides oxygen, but there's so much more. And so I'll just never forget, and I say that, but I can't remember what the fact was or exactly what the plant was, but just the little light bulb that goes off in my head when I found out a cool fact about a plant that I didn't know before. And then your brain starts going, and then before you know it, you see that plant everywhere. It just jumps out of the background. And the more you learn, the more plants jump out of the background, and then before you know it, you're just like, you know all these plants. And when you know about things, and you care about them, and you want to take action a lot more. And so that's really the goal, is just to make that connection with people. So whether it's making a terrarium that is like a little miniature garden, or whether it's teaching people about soil, or teaching people about house plants. I mean, there's so many different ways you can go with plants. So we really try to cover just about everything. But we have basically, for our adult programming, we have 4 pillars. So we have health and wellness, we have art and culture, we have nature and conservation, and horticulture and gardening. So we have, a monthly series of gardening classes taught by our wonderful horticulture staff, and a lot of different subjects there. We have yoga and meditation in the garden with that, kind of like nature as the backdrop. We talk about insects a lot. We talk about pollinators, monarchs. We have a big monarch event coming up in March. It's called March for Monarchs. We have a lot of partners in the Houston area that, we all care about monarchs and we want to save them. So we get together on one day, kind of celebrating them coming back to the U.S. from Mexico, and try to teach people, how they can help them at home. So yeah, we do a lot.
I have a slight bias because I've actually long ago served on a panel discussion kind of in the arts and culture vein of things. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that arts and culture component, because I think that's certainly an interest of mine, but also I think something very important that doesn't always spring to mind in botanical work.
I mean, wow, we've had, talks on ethnobotany. We have a yearly sort of Aztec New Year celebration.
Oh, wow.
So we'll be having, just like a little thing on March 16th, just to kind of tell people about the significance of the time of year, how they plant the corn and the beans and the squash and Three Sisters Garden, and how that all kind of works together. So we like to celebrate the cultures. We like to celebrate the land that we're on, and the history of it. So we have cultural things. We have our Radiant Nature, which kind of celebrates Chinese culture. And then we have art. So we have art in the garden. We have sculptures. We do painting classes. We are going to be doing nature journaling coming up in April. So yeah, we explore it in, culinary, cultural practices. So, anything that we can do to celebrate. We're in a very, obviously a multicultural city. So we want to do a little bit of something for, as many of those cultures as we can.
No, and I mean, I do love that we keep coming back to culinary topics, which, in Houston is appropriate, right? Like, always just bring it back to food. We're in good shape. But I mean, I think that's something that also folks really... I know it's something for me that, even when I just had like little patio plants and that was all I had was, a little balcony, and just going outside and being able to cut a sprig of rosemary off and bring that in and, make a little quick compound butter and just get some herb butter going. I mean, that kind of engagement with things, which my friends would always laugh and, just be like, this is okay. Of course you're just pulling herbs, but it's like, but that's the point. Like, I care about food and I care about eating. And this is a really great way for me to have delicious things that I invite right in. But from that cultural standpoint, I mean, that's something that I hear particularly, we are an immigrant city. We are a city that is constantly bringing in new people from around the world. We're very proud of the fact of, the diversity of languages spoken in Houston. And that absolutely corresponds with what people deliberately grow, even if it is just out on those patios, to try to bring back a piece of home and cuisine and to reconnect with. And I think that's really valuable to reimagine, again, I promise I'm going to stop just beating up on rose gardens, but like the full function of what a garden can offer beyond just a singular type of plant, or just beyond even, what a pretty aesthetic space to be in, but actually, no, these plants are a part of our life. Like, these plants are something that, give us oxygen, absolutely, pretty important, but also feed us and make us whole in different ways that we don't think about, and correspond to festivities and celebrations. And so I really, really appreciate that kind of work. I'm going to ask a totally unfair question of you all now and say, if folks are coming to the garden, what is your number one recommendation? If there's a plant they have to see, if there's, maybe an area, which is pretty broad still, but, what are your must-sees for folks coming to and visiting the garden?
I will say the Arid Valley, which is going to be the arid section of the Global Collection Garden, and specifically to come right now. So we had this happen last year, but we have an agave we actually have two this year that are going to be blooming. We had one last year. If you've never seen an agave bloom, you've got to come and see it, and don't picture, like cut flowers or anything like that. But these two of our agaves are going to send these giant spikes up into the air. It's going to be incredible. And the Arid Valley is great all the time, don't get me wrong, but this is really one of those things. Again, nothing I would have ever pictured before I became associated with the garden and what this is. But these plants are so fascinating because they're, again, talking about plants and their energy. These plants are going to put all of their energy into these fascinating towering blooms, and then they're going to die. And it's fine because they're going to send off pups around them, and so all is not lost. But that's the lifetime. That's what this plant is there to do. That's what it's going to do. And so definitely, I just this morning was this on my mind because I was looking on my phone, and we've got our horticulturalist, Lindsay's colleague who's over the Arid Valley, is posting. He's super excited already, but there are two of them. And so, it's going to take a while. This is a big to do, for lack of a better term. And so you've got, a couple of months to come and really watch the progress, but it's just fascinating. It's something that, again, I don't think many of us have seen or really understand. And so I think that's a great place for people to really focus their attention.
Yeah, right now it looks like a giant asparagus.
Yeah.
So if you like asparagus, come take a look. And you're like, what? It's like this big around.
But then it's going to fan out. It's just, I can't put it into words.
It's interesting because then you're like, hey, yeah, agaves are in the asparagus family. Look.
I did not know that.
I know, right?
Okay, all right. All right, that's my mind-blowing fact for the day is, all right, the next time I make a margarita and pull out the agave, I'm going to be thinking about asparagus. Okay.
Maybe not the best combination, but hey. Okay, well, I will just have to call it the family garden because I have three boys, and it's sad because a lot of people don't make it that far out in the garden when they're visiting, and they may not realize. But if you go, if you walk past the culinary garden, and then you have kind of like a long path ahead of you, you'll reach a bridge. It takes you over the bayou. Then you'll see our greenhouse, and you kind of meander off to the right. And the family garden is just so much fun. The water play areas are a huge hit for kids. And so, if a family is like, oh, what do I do? I'm like, go that way. But it's just a really great big space, and it's got, 2 lagoons or ponds in there, and just tons of wildlife. Just so much fun. There's frogs, there's dragonflies, there's all sorts of water birds, turtles. Everything is just right there for you to see. So if your kiddo is especially into the wildlife, like, you have to go there because you can count the turtles, and you can you can watch the little fish and the frogs jump away, and it's really beautiful. They have a sort of like a rainbow garden around it. So they have all of the flowers, according to their rainbow colors. And there's some really amazing plants out there. It's a really great place to spend an afternoon.
It's also Louisiana iris and
bald cypress. Yes, that's where the Louisiana irises are. And
you're
cypress.
Speaking my language.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. All right.
You've got it.
I really do. Yeah.
It's awesome.
And come about April or May, those Louisiana irises will be putting on quite a show. So you can do that and also, be enamored by the Louisiana irises while you're there. I let them go first because I can't choose between the areas, but I would have to say, depending on whether you like it wet or a little bit slightly drier, the stormwater wetlands, it's kind of a wilder version of the family garden, at least in regards to the plant species and the fauna, the egrets and the herons that it attracts, and the turtles, and but you'd have to be willing to come across some snakes and stuff like that as well. Not all the time, but it is a possibility. And then the coastal prairie, because it's a good example of our tall grasses that make Texas prairies, specifically the coastal prairie grasses. There is something called the Big Four, and we have all of those grasses out at our coastal prairie garden. And that is your switchgrass, your Indian grass, your big blue stem, and your little blue stem. And then we also have eastern gamma grass, a lot of it, which down here in Texas we've called it the queen of grasses for a long time. It was very palatable for cattle back in the day. And so I could go either way. So stormwater wetlands or the coastal prairie if you want to see see those plants out in a wilder situation.
Well, plenty of great recs. We are rapidly running out of time, so before I let you go, I do have to ask, for folks who want to learn more about the programming or visit and get involved, how can they go about doing so?
So HBG.org. So that's the first three letters, HoustonBotanicGarden.org. Certainly social media as well, active on Instagram and Facebook for sure. Trying to keep those things updated as much as we can. You can sign up to join our newsletter down in the footer of our website. We send out a monthly newsletter and then typically at least one kind of in between, a lot of event-focused information there as well.
Wonderful. Well, Justin Lacey, Aaron Mills, Lindsay Ware, thank you so much for joining us and for telling us all about the great work that the garden is up to and getting us to know a little bit more about the Houston Botanic Garden.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's been fun.
We will now go over to our researcher, Jaden, who has a short piece on how you can get involved in Houston around town this week.
Hey y'all, the temperatures are starting to warm up, and that means that all of those insects that you should appreciate, but often don't, are now out and about, working hard to make our world a better place. Among them are essential pollinators, and now is the perfect time to learn more about how we can support them. On Sunday, March 9th, consider joining a group of passionate individuals at Brazos Bend State Park for an incredible event focused on saving the pollinators in our local community. This is a fantastic opportunity to connect with nature, meet like-minded people, and gain valuable insights from experts who are dedicated to protecting these vital creatures. This event is hosting two exceptional guest speakers, Nancy Denmark and Mark Morgenstern, who will share their expertise and practical tips on how we can play a role in safeguarding pollinators. Here's a sneak peek at what the day will look like if you register. From 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., start your morning with a relaxing cup of coffee and breakfast while mingling with fellow attendees. This is also the perfect chance to meet new people and get excited for the day ahead. From 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., listen to Nancy Denmark as she shares crucial information about challenges that pollinators face and what we can do to help them survive. Her insights might just change the way you view these creatures. From 11 a.m. to noon, join Mark Morgenstern for an engaging session on propagating native plants, an essential part of creating a pollinator-friendly environment. Then, from 12 to 12:30, enjoy a lunch break and some casual conversation, but don't forget to bring your own lunch. Then, from 1 to 2, step outside and soak up this marvelous weather that we've been having with a leisurely walk and tour of Morningstar Prairie's plant nursery. And then lastly, from 2:30 to 4:30, end the day with a breathtaking scenic tour of Nash Prairie, a beautiful natural place that serves as a haven for pollinators. This free event is open to all who are interested in learning more about pollinators and how to support them in their natural habitats. To sign up, visit signupgenius.com and search for Morningstar Prairie Plants, saving pollinators in your native habitat. Hopefully this opportunity excites you as much as it excites us. It's a great way to expand your knowledge, enjoy the great outdoors, and make a meaningful impact in your community. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Before we hop off, I want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in our spring fund drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes directly from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn all about the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month and support us. So thanks very much for that. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce, Sophia Soltez, and Naman Rinsdorf. Stay tuned for the No Expectations Show with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.